Greetings, booktubers, and welcome back to Grammaticus Books. Today on Grammaticus Books, we're talking Joe Haldeman and the Forever War. And specifically, we're talking, is this an autobiographical work by Joe Haldeman contained here in his 1974 science fiction novel, The Forever War? And the short answer to that question is yes, yes it is. And we're going to get into that. But here's how I'm going to structure the video here today. I'm going to do a brief overview of the book for anybody who might not be familiar with it, to get them up to speed. And then we're going to talk about Joe Haldeman in a very concise manner, but we're going to get some anchor points in Joe Haldeman's life that we're going to then take and then match into the book to see where these points match up with his life in the book and how they pertain to the book and how they shaped the novel that he wrote here in 1974. And actually, I should say that this book, it was published in 1974, but it was actually originally published in Analog magazine starting in 1971, and I think 72 and 73. Just let me check that. Analog magazine, 1972, 73, and 74. So it was originally published piecemeal in Analog magazine. And then after we do the biographical matchup, I will go into a discussion of the book by itself, just as a science fiction novel, a military science fiction novel, because it is wonderful. I just finished it today. I finished reading it today. It took me only 2 days to read it because it is so good. It's so wonderful. It's so well written that you just roll through it. His prose just leads you through the book. It makes you want to flip the pages. He leads you along. He paints a great picture, tells a fantastic story, and you just eat up the pages. And it's not particularly long. I think it comes at about 218 pages. So that's the book. So for those of you who might not be familiar with it, this is a military science fiction novel by Joe Haldeman. It is a Hugo and Nebula award-winning book from 1974, and it is an anti-war novel. Apparently about his experiences in the Vietnam War. Not apparently, but it is. And when I started reading this book 2 days ago, I had forgotten about all that. I originally read this book when I was in high school. I was probably either 16 or 17 years old, and all of the Vietnam references in here just went right over my head, and I missed it completely. So I started reading this 2 days ago. I got about 30 pages into it, and immediately what went into my head was, there's no way that Joe Haldeman is a veteran writing what he's writing in here, or if he is a veteran, there's no way that he's a combat veteran. And boy, was I wrong. So, because it intrigued me so much, I stopped reading it about page 30. I got on the internet, I looked it up, and I was like, wow, okay, he is a veteran, it's Vietnam. And then I put it into context of the Vietnam War, not necessarily a different, more modern context of the U.S. military. And then the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. But the novel here is a novel, it's about first contact. It's humanity versus a first contact with an alien species spanning the galaxy and spanning 1,143 years of time with the same character. And how can you do that? Because you're working with Einsteinian time dilation that moves people's perspective, their time perspective out over centuries and centuries as they're traveling close to the value of c, which is the exact speed of light. And Haldeman makes use of that time dilation for some great effect here in the book, which I'll go into later in the video. But I'll read you a little bit off of the back blurb of the book, and then that'll give you just an excellent sort of ground point if you're not familiar with the novel. So Private William Mandela hadn't wanted to go to war. William Mandela is the main character. But being one of Earth's best and brightest, he, along with the rest of his prime and promiscuous co-ed cadre, there's a lot of sex in this book, had been drafted into the interstellar conflict. Battling the Tarans was the least of his problems as he worked his way up through the ranks to major, and spanning the stars at faster than light speeds, he aged only months while Earth aged centuries. And though war in space was hell, Major Mandela soon learned it was nothing compared to coping with 1,200 drastically changing years back home. And that is a great synopsis of this book. And speaking of this particular book here, this is the paperback version of it that you see all the time. I like to go in and get different covers of different vintage paperbacks of whatever novel I'm talking about and put them up here on the screen. I'll do that here for this video as well. But there weren't that many of this book. This is the one that I own, and this is the one that keeps coming up most often. I think this got printed about a gazillion times, and that there might not have been that many reprints in the paperback form of it. But this is the book. So what is it about its autobiographical nature that we can match up? And the only way that we can do that is learning a little bit about Joe Haldeman first. So I'm going to go through and do a little biopic of Joe Haldeman, get some anchor points, and then we'll throw those anchor points up against references in the book and illustrate that for you guys here on the channel. So Joe Haldeman, great author, Hugo and Nebula Award-winning author, obviously. Born in 1943, in 1965, he marries the love of his life, Mary Gay, which is going to be important. And then in 1967, he finishes a degree in physics and astronomy from the University of Maryland. After finishing his degree, he's immediately drafted into the Army, because what's going on in 1967? It's the Vietnam War. So he gets drafted after he's out of college. College was a deferment back then, and as long as you were in college, you could avoid the draft or you wouldn't be drafted. But as soon as he finished his degrees, physics and astronomy, great degrees for a science fiction author or future science fiction author, he gets drafted into the Army and he's placed into the Combat Engineers, which is a pretty high-speed unit. It's a unit that you have to have a very high IQ in order to get into, even if you're an enlisted person in those units. That's the way it was in the more modern version of the U.S. Army, and I'm assuming that that's how it was back in Vietnam as well. I might be wrong. If anybody knows for sure, please correct me down in the comments section. So in 1967, he's drafted. He immediately goes to Vietnam. In 1968, he's severely wounded. His combat engineering unit is working with an enemy arms cache that had been booby-trapped. It goes off and it wounds and kills a large number of the people in his unit that he was working with, and he himself is severely wounded. He's sent back stateside to convalesce, and he has a very difficult transition back into life in the United States, and he's suffering from PTSD, although back then I don't think they had a PTSD diagnosis. So he really didn't have that support that a returning veteran today might get for PTSD symptoms. So his integration back into the U.S. society was very difficult for him, and society had changed a little bit from what he was used to in the military as well. And from there, he goes on, he recovers, and part of his recovery is he starts writing books, and I think his books were self-therapy. And he gets so good at writing books, he gets a master's degree in writing, and then he later is hired in by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he becomes a professor of writing at MIT. So there's a happy end to the story. So let's take those anchor points now, and then let's match them into this wonderful novel over here, The Forever War. So in The Forever War, the main character, Private William Mandela, he starts off as a private. His love of his life in this book is Mary Gay. It's his wife. He's put his wife into the novel. And I know what you're saying. Okay, a lot of authors, do that. They do a little shout out to their wives by including them in their books and their novels. And you always should do that when you are talking about your better half. It's not a bad thing to do to help prop up that relationship with your wife or your significant other. So, that might not be enough to make it autobiographical. But in addition to that, to start off with, the main character has just graduated from college and he's been enlisted into the United Nations Exploratory Force, just like Joe Haldeman in real life. He's a graduate of a STEM research field, and then he's in training and he's building a bridge in training, just like you would do if you were a combat engineer. So you've got that matchup with his life as well. And then after that, you have this character in the book, William Mandela, and he gets severely wounded, just like he did in real life, Joe Haldeman. And then William Mandela has to return home, and he has a very difficult and very awkward homecoming with his family that really doesn't go very well. And then at that point, he has to go back out into the Army and return in the book. He also has some quotes in here when you're reading this book and you're reading passages about how the war is going and William Mandela's thoughts on the war, and you will suddenly realize that Joe Haldeman is no longer writing about the Forever War. You have a thin onion skin veil over the top of what is actually Joe Haldeman writing about his direct experiences in Vietnam. And one of those is he's talking about wars and how wars are no longer won by military force alone, and that there's a multitude of factors that play into it, such as politics, propaganda, news media, and all these things now have to get factored into these war efforts, just like in Vietnam, and that shows up almost quote for quote here within the Forever War. The other thing that also gets put into this book, where you realize he's just talking about the war, is that there's propaganda, or not propaganda, but there's hate conditioning. There's literally mental hate conditioning that the soldiers have to undergo in order to motivate them to fight the Terrans, this first contact alien enemy that they've come across. And it goes horribly wrong, and there's a bunch of very adverse mental effects from this hate conditioning, this mental hate conditioning that's done by the UNEF forces, the United Nations Exploratory Force. And I think this is Joe Haldeman talking about the Army propaganda that went out about the Viet Cong and the NVC, or the NVA, I should say, during the war, that conditioned them to hate the enemy. And then after they had gone out there, lived in country, come into contact with the enemy, come into contact with the Vietnamese, that propaganda kind of washed off, and then you're left with this very sick feeling in the pit of your stomach. And that's what he's writing about here in the book, and that's what he's actually writing about with his experiences over in Vietnam. And then finally, I think that this book is a large degree of self-therapy for Joe Haldeman with his experiences, and I think it probably helped him a lot in order to recover from his PTSD. And he finishes up in the book with a mention that he says, "I was disgusted with the way that the human race conducted itself, and I was disgusted with the Army." And that's one of the lines out of the book. And again, it's really just Joe Haldeman inserting his experiences in Vietnam into this fantastic military sci-fi and anti-war novel. And so those are the matchups. Those are the anchor points that show that this is an autobiographical work. And this isn't a revelation by me. It's a recent revelation by me, but people have known this for quite a while. But it kind of gobsmacked me when I got 30 pages in and said, there's no way that this guy is a vet. And then found out that he was, and he was a wounded combat veteran. And then, of course, I had to put it into the proper framework. And it all fell in place. And because he's put so much of his personal experiences in here, it just makes it a really haunting and melancholy book that works, it even has a bigger impact and more hooks in you as a reader with the story, because he's writing from a place of personal experience, and it really comes through in the book. It's a really wonderful novel. By the way, I do, even though this is there aren't that many covers or variant covers for these paperbacks, these vintage paperbacks, this is a really good one here. I love the juxtaposition of a man in a soldier in a spacesuit, and then he's got a Civil War saber across his lap, and you got the times rolling behind him, the big timepieces. And I should give a shout out to the artist on here. And the cover art is by Murray Tinkelman. So those are the matchups. So now let's talk about the book. Let's take all that, put it aside, and just look at the book strictly as a military sci-fi novel and its merits as a novel. Okay, so we're going to talk about it as a novel on its own merits, outside of the autobiographical aspects of it. This is a wonderful, wonderful military science fiction novel. It is an anti-war novel, but at the same time, it manages to be just a wonderful adventure novel, a wonderful military science fiction novel, on top of being an anti-war novel all at the same time. And for that, it's just even better than if one was just solely an anti-war novel, or just solely a jingoistic pro-military novel, sci-fi military novel, like some other ones that I could mention. But the book starts in the far, far future of 1997. Yes, you heard me right. The book starts in 1997, where Private William Mandela has been drafted into the UNEF, which stands for the United Nations Exploratory Force, emphasis on the force, which is the world's military army that has been created in order to battle the Terrans. And humanity has come into conflict, into contact with the Terrans, and immediately war is broken out. And at this point, nobody has ever seen a Terran, but they are going to set up bases next to these, what are called collapsars, which are essentially wormholes which humanity has discovered that has let it jump throughout the galaxy. And it's these collapsars and these jumps throughout the galaxy that has brought man and the Terrans into conflict. And so now William Mandela is one of the very first soldiers to prepare to set up a base where they are going to come into conflict, and they may actually see Terrans for the first time. And you have references to Waldos, which is a Robert A. Heinlein word. You have lots of uses of drones back in 1974 that are very well thought out, very ahead of its time. You've got the warp gates and wormholes, which I'm not 100% sure, but I think for 1974, these collapsars, these wormholes, were probably a pretty new and novel science fiction idea. If somebody knows otherwise, in a major novel, please let me know down in the comments section. And because Joe Haldeman had a degree in physics and astronomy, he makes use of the time dilation as the ships are traveling to get to these collapsars. They have to go at sub-c, sub-speed of light, but very close to the speed of light. And then that creates these Einsteinian time dilation paradoxes where they're traveling and experiencing time at a different rate than people back on Earth are. So William Mandela keeps going out and he has these conflicts with the Tarans, and then they return back to the collapsar, the Stargate or the wormhole, and they return to an Earth that is now hundreds of years in the future. So as he's fighting these wars, he then has to come back and deal with an Earth society that has progressed hundreds of years while he's been gone. And you have this future shock and this culture shock that he has to deal with every time he comes back. And the war goes on for 1,143 years. And William Mandela fights through the entire conflict, and hence the name of the book, Forever War, which is also a reference to Vietnam, which went on for 10 years. So it's another little parallel he has going there. And it's a wonderful book. It's just written so well by Joe Haldeman. I enjoyed this book immensely. The whole military conflict that he writes it very convincingly. It's very adventurous, it's very exciting, but at the same time, the anti-war aspect of it and the madness of it definitely comes through out of this book. And what I really enjoyed about it as well is often when you get a book that's written at this high of a level, the author has difficulty wrapping it up. Like another mainstream author I could name, but I won't, but his initials are Stephen King. And this novel, unlike that, it sticks the landing. He just gets the landing, and I love the ending. He sticks the landing and the ending of this book, and I really, really enjoyed the ending of this book. It's a great ending to a great novel. And this is it, Joe Haldeman, The Forever War. If you guys have read it, I would love to hear your ideas on it, how you liked this book, what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it, what you thought about the autobiographical aspect of it. Did you realize it was an autobiographical aspect to it when you were reading it? Or like me, did it just sort of hit you out of the blue and gobsmack you when you're like, man, there's no way this guy was in the Army? And then, of course, he is. And I put it, and the reason I missed that one is because I put it into the wrong context. You had to put it into the right context. And when you put it into the right context of the Vietnam War and everything that was going on with it, then everything just falls into place. And it makes the books just so much better. But that's it, Joe Haldeman's The Forever War. I hope you guys enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. And please let me know what you thought of the book down in the comments section below. And if you knew that, or if that was a revelation to you about the autobiographical nature of the book as well. And with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. So this is Grammaticus saying take care, be safe, and I'll catch you guys next time.